The first thing he ever said to her was a mockery. "Shouldn't you be sewing?" The words, clipped and cold, were dropped into the stifling air of the Marley assembly rooms like stones into a still pond. Constance Abbott did not flinch. She had learned long ago that the best defense against the casual cruelties of her station was a stillness so profound it became a form of invisibility. She merely inclined her head, a gesture of deference so minuscule it was almost an act of defiance, and retreated a step further into the shadow of a wilting palm. To the Duke of Kestrel Chase, she was just another pale, unadorned woman hovering at the edges of the room, a moth among butterflies. He could not know that the very fabric of his fine coat, the deep indigo wool that clung so perfectly to his broad shoulders, was woven on looms she had personally seen repaired. He could not know that the wages of the man who had groomed his horse that morning, a tenant on the Duke's own land, were paid from accounts she balanced by candlelight until her eyes ached. He saw a poor relation, an unmarried dependent. He did not see the engine that kept half the county running. Constance's life was a study in such contradictions. She lived under the roof of her aunt, Lady Arabella Vickers, in a state of genteel servitude. Her late father, a merchant of brilliant mind and modest birth, had left behind a single valuable asset, the Abbott Textile Mill. Upon his death, his sister-in-law had swept in, a whirlwind of feigned grief and sharp calculation. Lady Vickers had taken in her poor, orphaned niece with a great show of charity, and in doing so, had gained control of the mill's considerable profits. Constance, with her father's head for figures and his quiet diligence, was the true master of the mill. It was she who negotiated with wool suppliers, she who calibrated the new steam-powered looms, she who ensured the 300 workers were paid on time, every time. It was her invisible labor that paid for her cousin Flora's London season, for the frothy French lace on her aunt's gowns, for the very champagne the Duke was now drinking. In return, Constance received a small room at the back of the house, a meager allowance she rarely saw, and the constant, suffocating pressure of her aunt's ambition. Lady Vickers spoke of the mill only in hushed, apologetic tones, as if it were a rather distasteful but necessary family ailment. The world of trade was vulgar, but the money it produced was exquisite. And so Constance was kept hidden, a secret, shameful source of wealth. At social gatherings like this one, her role was clear: to be present but unseen, to fetch shawls and carry messages, and to fade into the wallpaper whenever a gentleman of consequence drew near. Tonight, that gentleman was Gideon Devereux, the Duke of Kestrel Chase. A man forged in war and sealed by grief, he had returned to his ancestral home 2 years prior and promptly shut its doors, and his heart, to the world. He was a figure of grim fascination for the county, wealthy, powerful, and utterly inaccessible. His estate, a vast tract of land that bordered the town of Marley, was said to be in a state of managed decline, much like its master. He was here tonight only because the charity in question supported the widows of his father's regiment, a duty he could not ignore. Constance watched him from her corner. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, his face a mask of aristocratic boredom. He listened to the fawning pleasantries of her aunt and the obsequious chatter of men like Mr. Percival Sinclair with a stillness that was not patient, but predatory. He was waiting for them to finish, to get to the point, to release him from this purgatory of pointless talk. It was Mr. Sinclair who inadvertently provided the night's true drama. A man of polished manners and questionable ventures,
Sinclair was attempting to curry favor with the Duke.
He stood now beside the treasurer of the regimental fund, a flustered local solicitor named Mr. Jardine, pointing at a ledger spread open on a side table. "A simple error in the columns, Your Grace," Sinclair was saying, his voice smooth as oil. "Easily rectified. Mr. Jardine and I were just noting the description totals." Mr. Jardine, sweating under the Duke's impassive gaze, stammered. "Indeed, Your Grace. It seems we are short some £24, an oversight, to be sure." A murmur went through the small group that had gathered. £24 was a significant sum. The Duke's eyes, the color of a winter sky, narrowed. He did not look at Sinclair. He looked at the ledger. An oversight of that magnitude suggests incompetence. The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Vickers shot a venomous glare across the room at Constance, a silent command to make herself even smaller, to cease existing entirely. But Constance was not looking at her aunt. She was looking at the ledger. She had been tasked with fetching Mr. Jardine's satchel earlier in the evening, and as she had placed it on the table, her eyes had scanned the open page. Her memory, a vast and ordered library of figures and facts, had catalogued it without conscious thought. She knew where the error was. It was not a shortfall. It was a misplaced entry. A donation from the Drapers' Guild had been entered as an expense for stationery. A simple, foolish mistake. But to point it out would be to draw attention, to speak, to exist. It would violate every rule of her carefully managed survival. She watched Mr. Jardine fumble with the pages, his hands shaking. She saw the faint, triumphant smirk on Sinclair's face as he positioned himself as the clever one who had spotted the problem. And she thought of the widows. She thought of the £24 that would buy coal for the winter or food for their children. She thought of her father, who had always said that numbers told the truth if you only listened. Taking a single, steadying breath, Constance stepped out of the shadow of the palm. She moved not towards the Duke, but towards the table, her steps quiet and sure on the polished floor. The small group parted for her, surprised. She did not look at any of them. Her focus was entirely on the book. "Forgive me, Mr. Jardine," she said, her voice low and clear, carrying in the sudden hush. It was a voice unused to public speech, but steady nonetheless. "I believe the error is on page 17, line 8. The entry for the Drapers' Guild. It has been recorded in the debit column by mistake." Every head turned to her. It was as if a piece of furniture had spoken. Mr. Jardine stared, his mouth agape. Percival Sinclair's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of irritation. Lady Vickers looked as if she might faint from sheer mortification. The Duke, however, did not look shocked. He looked interested. For the first time that evening, a flicker of genuine attention lit his cold eyes. He shifted his gaze from the flustered solicitor to the pale, determined woman standing beside him. "Show me," he commanded. Constance reached out a steady hand, a hand accustomed to sorting threads and ruling lines, not to pointing out errors in front of dukes, and turned the page. Her finger traced the line of ink. "Here, sir, and here." She pointed to the corresponding entry in the Guild's own subscription list on a separate sheet. "The sums match. It is merely a transposition." A collective sigh of relief and understanding went through the onlookers. Mr. Jardine, overwhelmed with gratitude, began to babble his thanks. But the Duke cut him off, his eyes still fixed on Constance. He was silent for a long moment, studying her. He took in the plain gray dress, the severe hairstyle, the complete absence of jewelry. He saw the faint ink stain on her right forefinger. He saw the way she held herself, with a quiet dignity that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with endurance. She had not sought praise or attention. She had simply corrected an error, a small act of competence in a room full of posturing. "Your name," he said. It was not a question, but a demand for information. "Constance Abbott, Your Grace." "Abbott," he repeated, the name tasting strange on his tongue. He knew the Abbott mill. He did not know it came with a Miss Abbott. He looked from her to Lady Vickers, who was now attempting a pained, dismissive smile. The connection was made. The poor relation. The moth. He gave a single, sharp nod. "I see." He said nothing more. He turned away, the conversation concluded, and the assembly room slowly breathed back to life around them. But the moment had been marked. A connection had been forged, not of warmth or charm, but of something harder and more elemental. It was a recognition of competence. For the first time in years, someone had looked at Constance Abbott and had not seen a burden or a tool, but a mind. And that, she would later realize, was far more dangerous than being invisible. The walk home was a silent torment. Lady Vickers did not speak, a far more terrifying prospect than any of her usual tirades. Flora, her cousin, chattered nervously about the color of the Duchess of Trent's gown, her words fluttering into the oppressive quiet and dying there. Back inside the tall, narrow house on the edge of Marley's town square, the door had barely clicked shut before the storm broke. "How dare you!" Lady Vickers's voice was a venomous hiss. "How could you embarrass me so completely? Speaking up like a common clerk, in front of the Duke!" "I was only trying to help," Constance said, her own voice a quiet counterpoint. She stood in the hall, her hands clasped before her, a posture of submission she had perfected over a decade. "Help?" Her aunt's laugh was a sharp, ugly sound. "You were showing off. A pathetic attempt to draw attention to yourself. Do you have any idea the damage you have done? Mr. Sinclair was making such progress with the Duke, and you made us all look like shopkeepers." The irony was so bitter it almost made Constance want to laugh. "We are shopkeepers," she thought. "Or rather, I am, and you live on the proceeds." But she said nothing. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. Logic changed nothing. Silence was her only shield. She endured the rest of the tirade, her face a calm, pale mask. She thought of the mill, of the payroll she had to approve tomorrow. She thought of the new batch of indigo dye she had sourced, a deeper and more stable color than their last. And she thought of the Duke's eyes, the brief, sharp flare of interest in their gray depths. It was not pity. It was something harder and more respectful. A recognition. The incident, however, was not without consequence. 2 days later, the Duke's own carriage, a severe black coach emblazoned with the Kestrel Chase crest, pulled up before their door. It was an event so unprecedented that it brought the neighbors to their windows. Lady Vickers, assuming the visit was for her, was in a flutter of excitement and apprehension. She ordered Constance to her room, but the footman who knocked was specific. "His Grace, the Duke of Kestrel Chase, presents his compliments to Lady Vickers and requests a brief word with Miss Abbott." The shock in the hallway was palpable. Lady Vickers's face cycled through disbelief, fury, and, finally,
avarice. An audience with the Duke, even for her troublesome niece, was an opportunity. Constance was summoned. She entered the drawing room to find Gideon Devereux standing by the window, his large frame seeming to shrink the already cluttered space. He did not waste time with pleasantries. "Miss Abbott," he began, his voice as direct and unadorned as it had been at the assembly.
"I have a proposition for you." He turned from the window and his gaze swept over Lady Vickers, dismissing her, before settling on Constance. "My estate accounts are in disarray. My steward passed away 2 months ago, and the man he had training to replace him is inadequate." He paused, his eyes pinning her. "At the assembly, you demonstrated a faculty for numbers and an attention to detail. I require that faculty. I wish to employ you to conduct a full audit of the Kestrel Chase ledgers for the past 5 years." The silence in the room was deafening. Lady Vickers looked as though she had been struck. A duke employing her niece? As a clerk? The impropriety was scandalous. But the Duke was not finished. "You will be given a private office at Kestrel Chase. You will work from 9 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, Monday through Friday. For your services, I will pay the sum of £50 per month." £50? It was a fortune. It was more than Constance saw in a year. She saw her aunt's eyes widen, the gears of greed grinding behind her powdered facade. £50 a month? Paid to Lady Vickers, of course, for the use of her niece. "Your Grace," Lady Vickers began, her voice trembling with a mixture of outrage and excitement. "The very idea is unorthodox. My niece is a gentlewoman." "Your niece is a woman of talent," the Duke cut in, his voice sharp as flint. "I am offering to pay for that talent. The work is discreet and essential. Is she available or not?" The question hung in the air, a direct challenge. Constance found her voice. "I accept, Your Grace." All eyes turned to her. It was the first time she had ever made a decision of this magnitude without her aunt's permission. But this was not about social climbing or defiance. This was about work. It was about her skills being recognized and requested. More than that, the tenants of Kestrel Chase were the workers of the Abbott Mill. The health of the estate was inextricably linked to the health of her own enterprise. If the Duke's finances were failing, his tenants could not pay their rent, and if they could not pay rent, they could not afford to buy the goods her mill produced. It was all one interconnected system, a web she understood better than anyone. "It is a matter of business, Aunt," she said, her tone level and calm. "The Duke has made a business proposition. It would be foolish to refuse." The Duke gave a curt nod, a flicker of something like approval in his eyes. He understood. She was speaking his language, plainly, directly. The terms were settled. A contract would be drawn up. Constance would begin the following Monday. As the Duke departed, leaving a wake of stunned silence, Constance felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation. It was not joy, not yet. It was a quiet, thrilling hum of purpose. She was no longer just a secret engine hidden in a back room. She was being brought into the light, tasked with repairing another, grander machine. And she had a feeling that the cold, silent Duke of Kestrel Chase was a far more complex and broken mechanism than any ledger or loom. Her first day at Kestrel Chase was like stepping into a memory. The great house stood amidst its sprawling parkland, a masterpiece of stone and slate, but it felt less like a home and more like a monument to something long past. A profound stillness lay over everything, the silence not of peace, but of absence. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of winter light that pierced the gloom of the grand entrance hall, where furniture was shrouded in white linen ghosts. She was met at the door by a housekeeper, a woman with a face as grim and weathered as the stone walls around her. Her name was Effie, and her eyes held a deep, proprietary suspicion. She looked Constance up and down, taking in the simple, practical dress and the lack of airs, and seemed to find them wanting. "His Grace said you were to have the old steward's office," Effie said, her voice raspy.
"This way."
She led Constance through a labyrinth of cold corridors to a small, dark room at the back of the house. It smelled of dust, old paper, and disuse. A single window, filmed with grime, looked out onto a neglected courtyard. In the center of the room was a heavy oak desk, and against one wall, a series of towering shelves, groaning under the weight of dozens of leather-bound ledgers. They were piled in chaotic heaps, some spilling onto the floor, a 5-year testament to entropy.
"The Duke is out with the gamekeeper,"
Effie announced, as if this explained everything.
"He said you are to be given whatever you require, within reason."
She lingered for a moment, her disapproval a palpable force in the room. Then, with a sniff, she was gone. Constance stood alone in the silence, the scale of the task before her settling in. It was overwhelming. It was chaos. And she felt a strange sense of homecoming. This was a language she understood. Disorder was simply order waiting to be found. She did not start with the ledgers. Instead, she took off her bonnet and rolled up her sleeves. She found a dust cloth and a bucket of water. Methodically, she began to clean. She scrubbed the grime from the window pane, letting in a pale, watery light. She dusted the desk, the shelves, the chair. She arranged the scattered quills and dried up inkpots. Only when the room itself was brought to a state of basic order did she turn her attention to the books. She did not open them, not yet. First, she sorted them. By year, by type, household accounts, estate rents, wages, capital expenditures. She stacked them neatly on the shelves, creating a timeline from the chaos. It took her the entire morning. Her back ached and her hands were filthy, but a sense of profound satisfaction settled over her. At midday, Effie appeared with a tray. A piece of dry bread, a slice of hard cheese, and a cup of weak, lukewarm tea. It was a meal of disdain. Constance accepted it with a quiet, "Thank you, Effie," that seemed to surprise the older woman. In the afternoon, she finally opened the first ledger. And she understood the Duke's despair. It was not just messy. It was a tapestry of neglect and probable corruption. Entries were missing, sums were fudged, entire months of rental income were unaccounted for. The former steward, it seemed, had been covering his tracks for years. For the rest of the week, she followed the same routine. She would arrive precisely at 9, greeted by Effie's silent glower. She would work without pause, her quill scratching in the quiet room, making notes in her own precise, clear hand on separate sheets of paper. She was creating a map of the financial ruin, a guide back to solvency. She rarely saw the Duke. He remained a distant, brooding presence. Sometimes she would see him from her window, a tall, dark figure striding across the frosted lawns with his hounds, lost in a world of his own. He never came to the office. He never asked for a report. He simply let her work. It was a form of trust more profound than any kind word. He had given her a task and trusted in her competence to complete it. One afternoon, a week into her work, she was struggling with the poor light. The winter day was dying, and the single candle she had been allowed did little to illuminate the fine script of a particularly difficult page. Without thinking, she sought out the housekeeper. She found Effie in the vast, cold kitchen, polishing silver with a fierce, resentful energy. "Effie," Constance began, her voice soft. The housekeeper looked up, startled and annoyed. "I apologize for the interruption. I find I cannot see the columns properly. Would it be possible to have another candle?" Effie's expression soured. "Candles are expensive." Constance nodded. "I am aware, but not as expensive as the errors I might make in the dark. An extra candle would be an investment, I believe." She paused, then added, looking at the housekeeper's gnarled fingers, "That polish has a harsh smell. My father always preferred a mixture of lemon and olive oil for the silver. It is kinder to the hands." Effie just stared at her. Constance, feeling she had overstepped, gave a small nod and retreated back to her office. She expected nothing, but 10 minutes later, Effie appeared at her door. In her hands, she carried not one, but 3 candles in a heavy silver candelabra, its surface gleaming. She placed it on the desk without a word. As she turned to leave, she hesitated. "Lemon and oil, you say?" she asked, her voice gruff. "Yes," Constance replied gently. "And a soft wool cloth." Effie grunted and left. But the next day, when she brought Constance's midday tray, the tea was hot, and there were 2 slices of bread. It was the beginning of a quiet thaw. The house itself began to change, mirroring this small shift. Following Constance's example of bringing order to one small room, a maid was tasked with washing the windows in the main corridor. A footman began polishing the brass. The dust sheets in the library were removed. It was as if Constance's quiet, focused energy was contagious, waking the great house from its slumber. The Duke noticed. He noticed the way the light fell differently in the hall. He noticed the faint scent of lemon polish instead of dust. He noticed the sound, a sound he had not heard in years, the quiet hum of a house being cared for. He found himself altering his daily path to pass the steward's office. He would not stop, would not speak, but he would glance in. He saw her there, her head bent over the great books, a small, still figure in a sea of paper. Her presence was a point of order in the chaos of his life. He had hired her to fix his finances, but she was inadvertently mending his home. One afternoon, he found her not in her office, but in the long gallery, standing before a vast tapestry depicting a stag hunt. Her back was to him. She was not admiring the art. She was tracing the weave of the fabric with her finger, her expression one of intense concentration. He had been in a foul mood, wrestling with a letter from his solicitor about the endless legal tangles of his inheritance. The sight of her, away from her desk, sparked a flicker of his usual irritation. "Shouldn't you be with your numbers, Miss Abbott?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. She turned, unsurprised by his presence. Her calm was unnerving. "This is also my work, Your Grace," she replied, her voice even. She gestured to the tapestry. "The wool for this was likely sourced from the Cheviot Hills. The dyes are woad for the blue and madder for the red. The weaving technique is precise. It is a product of exceptional quality." She looked at him directly. "The Abbott Mill no longer produces this quality. Our best weavers left. Our suppliers provide inferior fleece. To understand how to fix my business, I must first remember what it was we were trying to make." He fell silent, chastened. He had seen a distraction. She had seen a textbook. Her world was not divided into art and commerce, work and leisure. It was all one thing. A world of materials, processes, and quality. A world of tangible facts. He looked from her earnest face to the faded tapestry. For the first time in a long time, he saw it not just as a decoration, but as the product of someone's labor, someone's skill. Just as he was beginning to see Constance Abbott not as an employee, but as a partner in the slow, arduous task of restoration. He gave a slow nod. "I see," he said, and this time the words were imbued with a new and startling depth of meaning. A brief shift in perspective. Gideon Devereux stood in the shadows of the gallery long after Miss Abbott had returned to her office. He was a man who trusted evidence above all else. The world was full of chatter, opinion, and sentiment, most of it false. But evidence, a hoofprint in the mud, the powder burns on a uniform, the precise debit in a ledger, that was real. That was truth. For 2 years, the evidence of his life had been one of decay. The house was silent, a reflection of the silence in his own soul. His brother, Ambrose, had been the life of Kestrel Chase. His laughter had echoed in these halls. His easy charm had smoothed over Gideon's own rough edges. When the news came from the battlefield, a sterile, official letter, it had not just stolen a brother, it had stolen the future. Gideon had returned from the same war, wounded but alive, to inherit a title he never wanted, and a grief so vast it swallowed all light. He had retreated into the numbers, the one place where logic was supposed to reign. But the estate accounts were just another form of chaos, another betrayal. The steward his father had trusted, the land he was supposed to protect, it was all rotting from the inside out. He had felt a grim, despairing validation in it. Everything fell apart. Everyone left. That was the evidence. Then came Constance Abbott. She was another piece of evidence, but one that contradicted all his conclusions. She was quiet in a world of noise. She was competent in a world of fools. She was honest in a world of liars. He had hired her as a tool, a human calculator to solve a practical problem. He had expected her to be efficient, and she was. He had not expected her to be restorative. He watched her from a distance. He saw the way Effie's scowl had softened. He saw the gardener, a man who hadn't spoken more than 2 words to Gideon in a year, asking Miss Abbott's opinion on planting a new kitchen garden. He saw the light burning in her office late into the afternoon, a small beacon of diligence in the encroaching dusk. She did not flatter him. She did not fear him. She simply met his gaze and stated facts. When she spoke of the tapestry, it was not the idle appreciation of a gentlewoman. It was the sharp, practical assessment of a master craftsman. She saw the world not for what it appeared to be, but for what it was made of. He found it profoundly calming. His own grief was a form of chaos, an internal storm of rage and loss that had no logic. But her presence, her methodical work, was a quiet anchor. She was putting his house in order, and in doing so, she was creating a space where he could begin to imagine putting his own life in order. It was not love. He would have scoffed at the word. It was recognition. He recognized in her the same qualities he valued in his best soldiers: resilience, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to the task at hand. He had thought himself entirely alone, the last responsible man in a collapsing world. But now, in the quiet corridors of his own home, he had found another. And this realization, this piece of new, unexpected evidence, was both terrifying and strangely hopeful. He was not used to hope. It felt like a vulnerability, a crack in the armor he had so carefully constructed. Yet he found himself drawn to it, to the quiet woman in the steward's office, as a plant is drawn to the first, tentative light of dawn. The quiet transformation of Kestrel Chase did not go unnoticed. News travelled fast in a place like Marley, and the news that the reclusive Duke was hiring staff, airing out rooms, and, most shockingly of all, paying his bills on time, was the subject of much gossip. The source of this change was quickly identified: the plain, overlooked niece of Lady Vickers. Percival Sinclair watched this development with growing alarm. He had spent the better part of a year cultivating the local gentry, positioning himself as a man of vision and influence. His grand project was a speculative land purchase in the Americas, and he needed investors. The Duke of Kestrel Chase, with his vast fortune, was the ultimate prize.
Sinclair had imagined himself becoming the Duke's trusted man of business, guiding the bereaved and distracted aristocrat's finances toward his own profitable ventures. Instead, that position of influence was being quietly usurped by a slip of a woman with an ink-stained finger. A woman who, Sinclair suspected, would see his own creatively balanced prospectuses for the flimsy gambles they were. Constance Abbott was a threat to his ambitions, and she had to be removed. His first line of attack was gossip. He began to drop subtle poisons into the tea-time conversations of Marley. "Such an unusual arrangement," he would murmur, a look of feigned concern on his handsome face. "A young, unmarried woman, alone in that great house with a man of the Duke's temperament. One worries for her reputation." He found a willing and eager ally in Lady Vickers. Her initial avarice over Constance's salary had soured into bitter resentment. The £50 a month was paid, as per the Duke's instruction, directly to her, but the credit, the social capital, was all going to Constance. People were speaking of her niece with a newfound respect, while Lady Vickers was seen as the grasping aunt who had hidden such a talent away. "It is a scandal," she would declare to her circle of acquaintances, fanning herself furiously. "My poor, naive niece, taken advantage of by that brooding, difficult man. I fear for her virtue. I fear for our family's good name." The whispers grew, weaving a tapestry of insinuation and doubt. The snubs, once reserved for Constance, were now directed at the Duke himself when he made his rare appearances in town. He ignored them with the same imperious disregard he showed everything, but Constance felt the chill. She heard the change in tone when she went to the draper's, the way conversations stopped when she entered the bakery. That is how counties turn on their own. Quietly, by degrees. But gossip and social pressure were having no effect. The work at Kestrel Chase continued. The Duke's trust in Constance only seemed to deepen. Sinclair realized he needed a more direct, more devastating weapon. He needed to destroy the very foundation of their relationship, the Duke's belief in her competence and honesty. He needed to provide evidence. His plan was as cruel as it was clever. He knew from his own attempts to swindle the Duke that Gideon Devereux was a man who believed what he could see and touch. An accusation would be dismissed. A forged document, however, could be damning. Through his own network of clerks and informants, Sinclair acquired several things. He procured a sample of the specific paper used for the Kestrel Chase ledgers. He commissioned a batch of iron gall ink to be mixed to the exact same recipe used by the estate's stationer. And, through a carefully placed bribe to a disgruntled stable boy, he learned Constance's routine. He knew she often worked late, and that she kept her own set of summary notes in a separate, smaller book. One evening, under the cloak of a winter storm, Sinclair made his move. While the household was distracted by a fallen tree blocking the main drive, he slipped into Kestrel Chase through a side entrance left unlocked by his confederate. He made his way to the steward's office. It was as he imagined, neat, orderly, a single candle left burning low. He found the main household ledger for the current year open on the desk. Working quickly, with practiced skill, he selected a page detailing payments to local suppliers. He found an entry for the Abbott Mill, a routine payment for new wool blankets for the staff quarters. With a surgeon's precision, he altered the number, changing a payment of £15
to 150. He then added a new, entirely fictitious entry below it, a payment of £200 to a C. Abbott for consultation and procurement services. He used a chemical agent to age the ink slightly, blending it almost perfectly with the surrounding text. It was a masterstroke of forgery. To the untrained eye, it would look like blatant embezzlement. A woman using her position to funnel a fortune from her employer into her own family business and her own pockets. It was a simple, greedy crime that the Duke, a man already betrayed by his previous steward, would be primed to believe. Sinclair did not leave it there. He took a small, silver letter opener from the Duke's own desk set and used it to make a series of tiny, almost invisible cuts on the edge of the page, a form of secret marking he had learned in his less reputable days. It would allow him to discover the page later, as if by chance. He slipped out of the house as unseen as he had entered, the taste of victory already on his lips. He would let a few days pass. Then he would request a meeting with the Duke to discuss his concerns. He would guide the Duke to the ledger, feign shock and dismay, and point to the irrefutable evidence of Miss Abbott's treachery. Her career would be over. Her reputation and her life in Marley would be ruined. And the path to the Duke's fortune would be clear once more. The trap was set. Now, he only had to wait for it to be sprung. Sinclair waited 3 days, a period of exquisite, agonizing patience. He spent the time composing the precise words of sorrowful discovery he would use. On the 4th day, he sent a note to Kestrel Chase, requesting an urgent and private audience with the Duke on a matter of grave importance to the estate's welfare. The summons came that afternoon. Gideon Devereux received him not in a comfortable drawing room, but in the cold, imposing library. The Duke was standing by the fireplace, one hand resting on the marble mantelpiece, his expression unreadable. The air was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the roaring fire. "Sinclair," the Duke said by way of greeting, "your note claimed urgency." "Indeed, Your Grace. It is a matter of some delicacy," Sinclair began, his voice pitched to a perfect frequency of reluctance and duty. "I would not trouble you with it if I were not certain. I have concerns about the new accounting practices." The Duke's eyes narrowed fractionally. "Concerns?" "I have reason to believe that your trust, our trust in Miss Abbott, may have been misplaced." Gideon did not react. His stillness was more unnerving than any outburst. "You are making a serious accusation. You had better have more than reason to believe." "I do, Your Grace. I have evidence." This was the moment. Sinclair played his part to perfection. "I happened to be reviewing some old contracts with my solicitor, and a question arose about supplier payments. On a whim, I asked to see the current household ledger, and I found something deeply troubling." He walked over to the long library table where a number of estate books were laid out. With the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for, he picked up the correct ledger. "If you would, Your Grace, page 94. He opened the book, his finger tracing down the page until it stopped at his handiwork. "Here." The Duke moved from the fireplace to the table. He looked down at the page. Sinclair watched his face, waiting for the flicker of anger, the hardening of his jaw. He saw the Duke's eyes scan the altered entry for the Abbott Mill, then the fictitious payment to C. Abbott. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. For a moment, just a moment, Gideon's face became the cold, hard mask he had worn when he first returned from the war. the face of a man who expected betrayal and had found it yet again. "I am so sorry to be the bearer of this news, Your Grace," Sinclair said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "It is a clear case of embezzlement. A common enough crime, I'm afraid, when one places too much trust in certain types." The Duke did not look at Sinclair. He continued to stare at the page. 1 second. 2. 3. Then he looked up, his gaze sweeping past Sinclair and fixing on the library door. "Effie," he called out, his voice a low command. "Fetch Miss Abbott. Tell her to come to the library at once." Constance arrived a few minutes later, her expression calm but questioning. She had been in the middle of reconciling the quarterly rent rolls. She entered the library and saw the scene. The Duke, standing like a statue of judgment behind the great table, Mr. Sinclair, a look of pious sorrow on his face, and the open ledger between them. Her heart, for the first time, gave a painful lurch. "Miss Abbott," the Duke said, his voice devoid of all emotion. He did not invite her to sit. He did not soften his tone. He gestured to the ledger. "Mr. Sinclair has brought this entry to my attention. Explain it." It was not an accusation. It was a command. A test. Constance moved forward and looked at the page. She saw the inflated payment to the mill. She saw the fraudulent entry for £200 made out to her. A cold dread washed over her, but it was immediately followed by a surge of pure, cold anger. This was not a mistake. This was a deliberate, malicious attack. She did not cry. She did not gasp or protest her innocence. She had learned long ago that hysterics were a currency she could not afford. Her defense would be the same as her work: methodical, precise, and based on fact. She leaned closer, her eyes scanning the page not as a victim, but as an expert. She ignored the two men watching her, focusing every ounce of her concentration on the ink and paper. Her mind, that vast and ordered library, began to work. "The sum for the mill blankets is incorrect," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "The actual payment was £15, not 150. The purchase order is on file in my office, number 7B. She then moved her finger to the second, more damning entry. "This payment was never made. It does not exist in my own cross-referenced cash book, which I keep as a daily record." Sinclair scoffed. "Of course you would say that. Your private records can hardly be considered proof." Constance ignored him. She was still looking at the page. She ran her finger lightly, very lightly, along the edge of the paper. She felt it. The tiny, almost imperceptible nicks. She looked closer at the ink of the fraudulent entry. She smelled it. The faintest trace of a chemical agent, different from the simple oxidization of the older ink around it. She looked up, not at Sinclair, but directly at the Duke. Her eyes were clear and unwavering. "This is a forgery, Your Grace." "A baseless accusation," Sinclair blustered. "The evidence is right there in front of you." "The evidence is indeed right here," Constance agreed, her voice gaining strength. "The ink, for instance. It appears to be iron gall, consistent with the rest of the ledger. But it has been artificially aged. You can see under the light here," she angled the book slightly, "a slight shimmer that the naturally oxidized ink does not have. It suggests a chemical accelerant was used." She then turned her attention to the paper itself. "And the paper. It is a very good match for your estate stock,
but it is not perfect. Feel the edge of the page, Your Grace." Gideon, his face still an impassive mask, reached out and did as she asked. "Now feel the edge of the preceding page," she instructed. He did. A flicker of understanding crossed his features. "The forged page has been trimmed," Constance stated, "not as a theory, but as a fact. The edge is microscopically rougher, and it bears a series of tiny patterned cuts, not from the bookbinder's plough, from a smaller blade, a personal tool."
"Perhaps," she added, her gaze flicking for a second to the silver letter opener on the library desk. "Something like a letter opener." She saved her final, most devastating piece of evidence for last. "But the most definitive proof is the watermark. Your stationer uses a custom watermark for the estate, the Kestrel Chase Falcon. It should appear in the upper right quadrant of every page." She held the page up to the light of the window. The original pages showed the faint, ghostly image of the falcon. The forged page was blank. "This page has no watermark," she said softly. It was a death blow, delivered in a whisper. The silence that followed was absolute. Percival Sinclair's face had gone from ruddy confidence to a pasty, sickly white. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was a man caught in a snare of his own making, exposed not by a confession or an accusation, but by the quiet, irrefutable power of fact. Constance stepped back from the table. Her work was done. She had not defended her honor. She had presented her findings. She had treated the attack on her character like any other accounting error, a problem to be identified, analyzed, and corrected. Gideon Devereux looked from the ledger to Constance's pale, composed face. He looked at Sinclair's crumbling facade. The cold mask he wore finally cracked. But it was not anger that replaced it. It was a look of profound, thoughtful respect. He had asked her to explain, and she had. Plainly. He had trusted his instinct that she was a woman of substance. The evidence she had just presented proved him right, beyond any doubt. The trust between them, tested by fire, had not just been restored, it had been forged into steel. The aftermath in the library was swift and silent. The Duke did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply looked at Percival Sinclair, a long, cold look that stripped away the man's last vestiges of composure. "The magistrate in Marley is an old friend of my father's," Gideon said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of iron. "He takes a particular interest in matters of forgery and fraud. I will be sending a carriage for him in the morning. I suggest you do not keep him waiting." He did not banish Sinclair from the house. He simply turned his back, a gesture of dismissal so complete it was more devastating than any command. Sinclair, his face a mask of ashen disbelief, stumbled backward, turned, and fled the room. The sound of his hurried, panicked footsteps echoing in the hall was the only sound of his defeat. When he was gone, the Duke turned back to Constance. She was still standing by the table, her hands clasped before her, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly draining away, leaving her feeling hollow and tired. He walked around the table until he stood before her. He looked at the ledger, at the evidence of the crime, and then at her. He could have succeeded, he said, more to himself than to her. With anyone else, he might have. "You believed me," she stated, a hint of wonder in her voice. "I believe evidence," he corrected her, though his eyes told a different story. "You provided it." He reached out, his fingers gently touching the back of her hand where it rested on the table. It was a brief, startling touch, a spark of warmth in the cold room. "Your hands are steady," he observed. "Even now." "They are all I have ever been able to rely on," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. A new understanding passed between them in that moment, an unspoken acknowledgement of the trust that had been tested and proven true. It was a bond stronger than any contract. That evening, a flurry of invitations were dispatched from Kestrel Chase. They were printed on heavy cream card, announcing a formal dinner to be held in 1 week's time. The guest list was a carefully curated collection of the county's most influential figures: the Lord Lieutenant, the local magistrate, the most prominent landowners, and, of course, Lady Arabella Vickers, her daughter Flora, and the sharp-tongued but deeply respected Dowager Duchess of Trent. The stated reason was to celebrate the successful audit of the estate, but the entire county buzzed with the real, unspoken purpose. Something was about to happen. A reckoning was coming. The week leading up to the dinner was a whirlwind of activity at Kestrel Chase. The house, already stirring to life, now burst into full bloom. Under Constance's quiet direction, and with Effie's surprisingly enthusiastic support, the great dining room was aired and polished. The family silver, gleaming from its recent applications of lemon and oil, was laid out. Flowers from the newly revived greenhouse filled every room. It was not just a house preparing for a party, it was a declaration of restoration. Constance, for her part, felt a growing sense of trepidation. She was a woman of ledgers and looms, not of state dinners and public confrontations. She asked the Duke what he intended. "I intend to show them," he said simply, as they stood in the dining room overseeing the placement of the candles. "I intend to show them what Kestrel Chase is now, and who is responsible for it." The night of the dinner arrived. Constance wore a dress of deep blue velvet, the color of a twilight sky. It was a simple gown, devoid of the lace and frills her cousin Flora favored, but the fabric was of a quality the Abbott Mill had once been famous for. The Duke had procured it for her, a silent acknowledgement of their shared purpose. When she descended the grand staircase, she saw him waiting at the bottom. He was in formal evening attire, a severe figure of black and white, but his eyes, when they met hers, were warm. He offered her his arm, not as an employer to his clerk, but as a host to his partner. The guests arrived, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Lady Vickers, smelling triumph in the air, for surely this was the prelude to the Duke announcing her niece's dismissal, was dressed in her finest silks. She barely acknowledged Constance, her attention fixed on the Dowager Duchess Trent, a woman whose opinion could make or break a reputation with a single, well-aimed comment. The dinner was a masterpiece. The food was exquisite, the wine flowed, and the Duke, to everyone's astonishment, was a gracious and attentive host. He drew out his guests, spoke of his plans for improving his tenants' cottages, and listened with genuine interest to their concerns. Kestrel Chase was no longer a tomb. It was the vibrant heart of the county once more. Finally, when the dessert plates were cleared and the port was being passed, the Duke rose. A hush fell over the room. "My friends, my neighbors," he began, his voice calm and resonant. "I have gathered you here tonight for a purpose. For 2 years, this house has been silent. For 2 years, this estate has languished. I have been, by any measure, a poor steward of the lands and the people entrusted to my care." He paused, letting the admission hang in the air. It was a startling display of humility from a man known for his pride. That is changing. And it is changing because of one person's integrity, intelligence, and tireless work. He turned his gaze down the long table, and every eye followed his, settling on Constance. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. "Miss Constance Abbott," the Duke announced, "has in 3 short months accomplished what I believed to be impossible. She has brought order from chaos. She has restored the finances of this estate, and in doing so, has begun to restore its soul." A murmur of surprise ran through the room. Lady Vickers's smile tightened.
"In the course of her work," the Duke continued, his voice hardening slightly, "Miss Abbott uncovered years of mismanagement and fraud. But she also uncovered a more recent and more malicious attempt to harm this estate. An attempt to defraud me, and more despicably, to ruin the reputation of an innocent woman through forgery." The room was utterly silent now. The air crackled with tension. "The man responsible, Mr. Percival Sinclair, has already been dealt with. The magistrate," he nodded toward the stern-faced man at the end of the table, "has the matter in hand. Mr. Sinclair will not be troubling us again." He then turned his gaze upon Lady Vickers. It was a cold, deliberate look. However, the investigation brought another, smaller injustice to light. I have been paying a handsome salary for Miss Abbott's services, a salary which, I have discovered, was never passed on to her. Lady Vickers's face went from pink to mottled red. She looked around, desperate for an ally, but found only the cold, judgmental eyes of her peers. "Therefore," the Duke declared, his voice ringing with authority, "I am taking 2 actions. First, I have decided to make a significant investment, not in some foolish overseas venture, but here, in our own community. I am investing in the future of the Abbott Textile Mill, to see it restored to its former glory and beyond." He let that sink in, then delivered the final blow. "Secondly, all funds, both from my investment and from her continued employment, will be paid directly to its new managing partner, Miss Constance Abbott." He raised his glass. "To Miss Abbott, the true mistress of her trade." The Dowager Duchess Trent was the first to her feet. "To Miss Abbott," she cried, her sharp old voice cracking like a whip. One by one, then all at once, the other guests rose, their glasses held high. The room filled with a chorus of acclamation. It was a complete and public vindication. Constance sat in her chair, the sound of her own name echoing in her ears, her composure finally breaking, not in tears of sorrow, but in 2 single tears of overwhelming, cathartic relief that traced slow, warm paths down her cheeks. Lady Vickers, exposed and humiliated, had become the invisible one in the room. The power had shifted. The ledger was balanced. The guests departed in a flurry of excited whispers, leaving a transformed kestrel chase behind them. The air, once thick with tension, now felt light and clean. Lady Vickers and her daughter had been among the first to leave, a silent, ignominious retreat. The great house was quiet again, but it was a warm, living silence, the comfortable quiet of a home at peace. Constance stood in the great hall, watching the last of the carriage lights disappear down the long drive. She felt a strange sense of unreality, as if she had been an actor in a play that had just reached its triumphant conclusion. The blue velvet of her dress was a comforting weight, a tangible reminder of the evening's events. The Duke came to stand beside her. He did not speak for a long moment, simply sharing the silence, watching the darkness where the road had been. The fire in the huge hearth crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. "It is done," he said finally, his voice low. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her own voice still thick with emotion. "The public declaration." "Yes, I did," he countered, turning to face her. The firelight caught the sharp planes of his face, softening his usually severe expression. "Men like Sinclair, and women like your aunt, thrive in the shadows. They count on good people being too polite, too timid to call them out. The only cure for that kind of poison is sunlight. You brought the evidence to light in the library. I merely opened the curtains for the rest of the world to see." She looked down at her hands, the hands he had called steady. They were trembling slightly now.
"I don't know how to thank you."
"There is no need for thanks," he said. "You earned it. Every word." He paused, and a new, more serious note entered his tone. Constance. He had never used her given name before. It sounded strange and wonderful on his lips. She looked up, her heart giving a sudden, powerful beat. "It was not just the ledges," he said, his voice earnest, stripped of all artifice. "It was the house. It was the people. It was me. You brought it all back to life. I was living in a ruin, and I did not even know it until you came and began to rebuild." He took a step closer, his presence filling her senses. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. "I am not a man for poetry, Constance. I am not my brother. I do not have his easy charm or his way with words. My world is one of facts, of evidence. And the evidence of my own heart tells me that I cannot face another day without you in it." His words were plain, unadorned, but they struck her with more force than any flowery sonnet. This was his language, the language of truth, plainly spoken. "I am asking you to stay at Kestrel Chase," he continued, his gaze intense. "Not as my accountant, not as a partner in the mill, but as my wife, as my duchess." He then did something that stunned her more than anything else that evening. Gideon Devereux, the proud, unbending Duke of Kestrel Chase, slowly went down on one knee before her on the cold stone floor of his ancestral hall. He took her hand, his large, warm palm completely enveloping hers. "I am not offering to rescue you, Constance Abbott. God knows, it is you who have rescued me. I am offering you a partnership. In all things. In the house, in the business, in life. To face it all, together." Together. The word he had used when they first agreed she would help him. It had been a word of business then. Now, it was a vow. Tears welled in her eyes again, but these were tears of profound, unbelievable joy. She looked down at this formidable man, this duke who had seen her, truly seen her, when no one else had. He was not offering her a title or a fortune. He was offering her a place by his side, as an equal. He was offering her a home. She tightened her grip on his hand. Her voice, when she spoke, was as clear and certain as one of her ledger entries. "Yes," she said. It was the simplest of words, but it contained her entire heart. Yes, plainly. Together. He rose, his face transformed by a slow, rare smile that lit him from within. He drew her into his arms, and as he lowered his head to kiss her, Constance knew she had finally found the one column where she truly belonged. 1 year later, the world was a different color. The trees of Kestrel Chase were dressed in the vibrant greens of late spring, and the gardens, once choked with weeds, were a riot of tulips and narcissus. The house itself seemed to breathe, its windows open to the warm air, the sound of laughter and life echoing in its halls for the first time in a generation. Constance, Duchess of Kestrel Chase, stood on the terrace, a letter in her hand. It was from her cousin, Flora. After the public humiliation, Lady Vickers had retreated from society, selling the house in Marley and moving to a small cottage in Bath, where her social pretensions found little purchase. Flora, however, had surprised everyone. Freed from her mother's relentless ambition, she had married a quiet country doctor and, according to her letter, had just discovered a surprising aptitude for managing his accounts and a deep satisfaction in tending her own small garden. It was not a full redemption, perhaps, but a quiet, imperfect peace. Constance was glad for her. Gideon came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Good news?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "Hopeful news," she corrected, leaning back against his solid warmth.
Flora sends her love.
They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out over the thriving estate. In the distance, they could hear the rhythmic clang of a hammer on an anvil. Repairs were being made to the west wing. The tenants were prosperous, the land was productive, and the Abbot Devereux Mill, as it was now known, was a model of efficiency and fair wages, producing the finest wool cloth in the country. Later that day, they walked into Marley, not in a grand carriage, but on foot, their 2 hounds trotting happily beside them. The townspeople no longer fell silent when Constance passed. They greeted their Duchess with genuine warmth and respect. She was not just the Duke's wife. She was the woman who had saved the mill, who had secured their jobs, who spoke to them with the same directness and fairness she showed everyone. She was one of them. That evening, back in the familiar comfort of the library at Kestrel Chase, Gideon had a gift for her. It was a large, beautifully crafted book, bound in dark blue leather. "I thought it was time," he said, placing it in her hands. She ran her fingers over the smooth cover. Embossed in simple gold leaf were her new initials. C.A.D. Constance Abbot Devereux. "For our accounts," he said, a smile playing on his lips. She opened it. The pages were thick, creamy, and watermarked with the Kestrel Chase falcon. On the first page, in his strong, clear hand, Gideon had written a single entry. It was not a number, but a sentence. "For Constance, my partner, my Duchess, my heart." She looked up at him, her own heart full to bursting. The recurring symbol of her life, the ledger, once a record of thankless labour in a dusty back room, was now a testament to a shared future, bound in love and respect. She closed the book, the sound a satisfying thud in the quiet room. The accounts were settled. A new story was just beginning. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.